Hello. There we go. I can hear myself now. I am a touch delayed, but what else is new? So, okay, now where's my audio? Okay, still got audio. Cool. Okay, I'm gonna look at Twitter to see if it actually did the things the bots are supposed to do. Boop. Are my bots working? Bots are there. And I haven't seen anything from either bot yet. Okay. And one of them is posted. So Stream Elements is posted. Is Fossa going to cooperate? Nothing from Fossa yet. Well, the Stream Elements spot posted. Okay. Let me. Wonder if Fossa bot's even active yet. Okay, where's Fossa bot? Okay, Fossa's active. Huh. And looks like I need to fix that then. No, that's a Stream Elements issue. Forsooth and Buggery. I'll figure out why it's still doing that. Cool at the end. Chatbots. Commands. Some commands. Okay, so there's just one too many things on there. It's that one. Don't you just love having to fix things while you're actually streaming? Ooh. Okay. What's that one? Yeah, don't know what drop that was. Get up with that. Do, 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 do. Darn it, that one there. Okay. Okay, well, that's craziness. Check. See if Fawcett woke up or not. Okay, so Fawcett did not do the Twitter announcement. So I guess that's okay. This one says integration saved. Okay, Fawcett's still not going to work. So how are we doing tonight, Cubs? We all good out there? Now, I did say that the book I'm reading tonight is Another old book. Literally, some of the ones in here are over a century old. As the story's going back to, let's see, what's the oldest one listed? Let's see, oldest copyright mentioned 1879. So, yeah, 1870 looks, 1879 looks like the oldest story in here. That's weird. Listen to audio while I'm reading. I'm trying to do shit tonight. Looks like all my bots are at least working. Let's see, how far are we at? 13 minutes already. No, that was crazy. Let me go ahead and switch over. Hello? There we go. Now, in case people have missed previous messages, I'm going to be out of town next week. So, we're almost at the 15-minute mark. That's usually when I try to start. Hopefully I'm not going to burst into random fits of coughing, but you know how that happens. I mean, I mentioned it and I coughed. Okay. Okay, well, we are 15 minutes in, so let's get started, Cubs. So the first story in this book is Bob by Sidney Lanier. Bob is our mockingbird. He fell to us out of the top of a certain great pine in a certain small city on the seacoast of Georgia. In this tree and a host of his lordly fellows which tower over that little city, a mockingbird abound is unusual numbers. They love the prodigious masses of the leaves and the generous breezes from the neighboring Gulf Stream, and, most of all, the infinite flood of sunlight which is so rich and cordial that it will make even a man lift his head towards the sky, as a mockingbird lifts his beak and tries to sing something or other. About 3 years ago, in a sandy road which skirts a grove of such tall pines, a wayfarer found Bob lying in a lump. It could not have been more than a few days since he was no bird at all, only an egg with some possibilities. The finder brought him to our fence and turned him over to a young man who had done us the honor to come out of this strange country and live at our house about 6 years before. Gladly received by this, Bob was brought within, and the family discussions were held. He could not be put back into a tree. The hawks would have him in an hour. The original nest was not to be found. We struggled hard against committing the crime, as we had always considered it of caging a bird. But finally became plain that there was no other resource. In fact, we were obliged to recognize that he had come to us from the hand of Providence, and though we were among the most steady-going Democrats of the Republic, we were yet sufficiently acquainted with the etiquette of courts to know that one does not refuse the gift of a king. Dimly hoping, therefore, that we might see our way to devise some means of giving Bob an education that would fit him for a forester, and arrange suitable accommodations for him, and he was tended with motherly care. He repaid our attentions from the very beginning. He immediately began to pick up in the flesh and to increase the volume of his rudimentary feathers. Soon he commenced to call for his food as lustily as any spoiled child. When it was brought, he would throw his head back and open his yellow-lined beak to a width which no one could credit who did not see it. Into the enormous cavity, which seemed almost larger than the bird, his protectress would thrust, and more vigorously the better he seemed to like it, ball after ball of the yolk of hard-boiled egg, mashed up with Irish potato. A short time after he became our guest, a couple of other fledglings were brought and placed in his cage. One of those soon died, but the other continued for some time longer to drag out his drooping existence. One day, when Bob was about 6 weeks old, his usual tradition had been delayed, owing that to the pressure of his other duties upon his attendant. He was not slow to make any circumstance known by all the language available to him. He was very hungry indeed, and was squealing with every appearance of entreaty and of indignation when at last the lady of the house was able to bring him his breakfast. He scrambled to the bars of the cage, which his feeble companion was unable to do, took the proffered ball of egg and potato fiercely in his beak, and then, instead of swallowing it, he deliberately flopped back to a sick guest in the corner and gave him the whole of it without tasting a morsel. A mockingbird is called Bob, just as a goat is called Billy or Nan, as a parrot is called a Paul, or a squirrel is called a bunny, or that a cat is called a pussy or a Tom. Our bird continued to bear the common appellation of his race, and no efforts on the part of those who believe in the fitness of things availed to change the habits of Bob's friends in particular. Bob he was, and is, and probably will remain. Perhaps under a weightier title he would not have been thriving so prosperously. His growth was amazing in body and in mind. By the time he was 2 months old, he clearly showed that he was going to be a singer. About this period, certain little feeble trills and experimental whistles began to vary in the monotony of his absurd squeals and chirps. The musical business and marvelous work of feathering himself occupied his thoughts continually. I cannot but suppose that he superintended the disposition of the black, white, and gray markings of his wings and tail as they successively appeared. He certainly manufactured the pigments which those birds were laid on somewhere within himself, and all out of egg and potato. At this present writing, Bob is most elegantly trim, electric, and persuasive, cunning, tender, courageous, artistic little dandy of a bird that mind can imagine. He does not confine himself to imitating the songs of his tribe. He is a creative artist. I was witness, not long ago, to the selection of him adopted by him of a rudimentary whistle language. During an illness, it fell to my lot to sleep in a room alone with Bob. In the early morning, when a lady, to whom Bob was passionately attached, would make her appearance in the room, he would salute her with a certain joyful chirp, which appears to belong to him particularly. I have heard it. I have not heard it from any other bird. But sometimes a lady would merely appear, open the door, and make an inquiry, and then retire. Now, it was necessary for his artistic soul to find some form of expressing grief. For the purpose, he selected a certain cry, almost identical to that of a cowbird, an indescribably plaintive, long drawn, thin whistle. Day after day, I heard him make use of these expressions. He had never done so before. The mournful one he would usually accompany as soon as the door was shut, with the sidelong, inquiring posture of his head, which was clear repetition of the lover's "Is she gone? Is she really gone?" There is one in particular in which Bob's habits cannot be recommended for the young readers of the Sunday magazine. He eats very often. In fact, if Bob should hire a cook, it would be absolutely necessary for him to write down his hours for her guidance, and this writing would look very much like a timetable of the Pennsylvania, or on the Hudson River, or on Old Colony Railroad. He would have to say, "Bridget will be kind enough to get me my breakfast at the following hours: 5, 5:20, 5:40, 6, 6:15, 6:30, 6:45, 7, 7:20, 7:40, 8, and so often every 15 or 20 minutes until 12 midnight. My dinner at noon, 12:20, 12:40, 1, 1:15, 1:30, and so on every 15 or 20 minutes until 6 p.m. My supper is irregular, but I wish Bridget particularly to remember that I always eat whenever I'm awake in the night, and that I usually awake 4 or 5 times between bedtime and daybreak. With all this eating, Bob never neglects to wipe his beak after each meal. This he does by drawing it quickly 3 or 4 times on each side against his perch. I never tire of watching his motions. There does not seem to be the least friction between any of the component parts of his system. They all work, give, play, in and out, stretch, contract, and serve his desires generally with a smoothness and soft precision truly admirable. Merely to see him leap from his perch to the floor of his cage is to me a never failing marvel. It is so instantaneous, and yet so quiet. Clip, and he is down, with his head up and the food cup. I can compare it to nothing but the stroke of fate. His repertory of songs is extensive. Perhaps it would have been much more so if his life had been in the woods, where he would have all the opportunity to hear the endless variety and calls of his race. So far as we can see, the stock of songs which he now sings must have been brought in his own mind out of the egg, or in some further source whereof we know nothing. He certainly never learned these calls. Many of the birds of whom he gives the particular imitations of have always been beyond his reach. He does not apprehend readily a new set of tones. He has caught 2 or 3 musical phrases from having them whistled near him. No systematic attempt, however, has been made to teach him anything. His procedure in learning these few tones was peculiar. He would not, on first hearing them, make any sign that he desired to retain them, beyond a certain air of attention in his posture. Upon reception, on a different day, his behavior was the same. There was no attempt at imitation, but some time afterwards, quite unexpectedly, in a hilarious flow of his bird songs would appear a perfect reproduction of the whistled tones. Like a great artist, he was rather above futile and amateurish efforts. He took things into his mind and turned them over, and when he was perfectly sure of them, brought them forth with a perfection with unconcern. He has this little joke. His favorite response to the endearing charms of the lady whom he loves is to scold her. Of course, he understands that she understands his wit. He uses for the purpose of angry warning cry in which the mockingbirds are in the habit of employing to drive away intruders from their nests. At the same time, he expresses his delight by a particular gesture, which he always uses when pleased. He extends his right wing and stretches his leg along the inner surface of it for as far as he is able. He has great capacities in the way of elongating and contracting himself. When he was curious or alarmed, he stretches his body until he seems incredibly tall and to the size of his neck all the way. But when he is cold, he makes himself into a perfectly round ball of feathers. I think I envy him most when he goes to sleep. He takes up one leg under somewhere into his bosom, crooks the other to a trifle, shortens his neck, closes his eyes, and it is done. He does not appear to hover a moment in the borderland between sleeping and waking, but hops over the line with the same superb decision which he is known for dropping from his perch to the floor. I do not think he ever has anything on his mind after he closes his eyes. It is my belief that he never committed a sin of any sort in his whole life. There is but one time when he ever looks sad. This is during the season when his feathers fall. He is then unspeakably dejected. Never a note do we get from him until it is over. Nor can he be blamed. Last summer, not only was the usual loss took place, but every feather dropped from his tail. His dejection during this period was so extreme that he could not but believe he had some idea that his personal appearance under the disadvantage of no tail. This was so ludicrous that his most ardent lovers could scarcely behold him without a smile, and it appeared to cut him to the soul that he should excite such sentiments. But in a surprisingly short amount of time his tail feathers grew out again, and the rest of his apparel reappeared fresh and new, and he was lifted up by the head so much that whenever he wished to fill the house with a gay, confident, dashing, rotonious, innocent, sparkling glory of jubilation, we have only to set Bob's cage where a spot of sunshine will fall upon it. His beads of eyes glisten, his form glows intense. Up goes his beak, and he is off. Finally, we have sometimes discussed the question: is it better, on the whole, that Bob should have lived in the cage than in the wildwood? There are conflicting opinions about it, but one of us is clearer than it is. He argues that, although here are many songs which are never heard, and there are many eggs which never hatch, yet the general end of a song is to be heard, and that of an egg is to be hatched. It further argues that Bob's life in a cage has been one long lesson to several people who stood in need of him, whereas in the woods, leaving aside the possibility of hawks and bad boys, he would have not been likely to gain one appreciative listener for a single half hour. But on each year, yeah, well, I was into that one. Cool. I slipped into an accent because that's what happens. Sorry. I don't know if it recorded it. What? It's, I felt like I was speaking an accent. I don't know if anyone gathered that or not, but yeah, fun times. Okay, let's see. Next one, The Welcome Rain by Clarence Ousley. It was the most welcome and the most beautiful rain that ever fell. Welcome to a thirsting earth, parched and cracked and bare, with cattle almost starving upon grass withered and scorched and dry as straw, with corn spindling and struggling and jaundiced, with cotton not yet sprouted or not even planted in the hard, unyielding clods, with spring gardens and flower beds almost as sere as the last days of summer, with farmers, stockmen, merchants, bankers, manufacturers, and railroaders still nervous from last year's panic, counting accrued losses from the exaggeration of the business blues. Why, it was welcome as mama and about as desperately needed. And beautiful beyond any other beauty of nature or art at their best. Literally beautiful. The dream of the poet, the rhapsody of the painter, materialized in a shower of silver and perfume, visible and sensible to the sight and smell, and the rainbow and the pot of gold attend, literally, really and truly. It started a little after 5 o'clock in the midst of this blistering, dust-choked gale from the southeast. Big blue sputtering drops fell and sprinkled on the sidewalks and roads. The ladies who were driving whipped up a little, and the men who only looked skyward wistfully and doubtingly and went about their business. They had been bluffed too often to take the clouds seriously. It sputtered on. The womenfolk lay down the whip harder. Those animals sniffed the moisture and they broke into shelter. The doubting Thomases began to take notice and look hopeful. A great blanketing cloud with white fringe was spreading over the northwest, and the darker one crept slowly along the southern horizon. The wind held steady, and the drops fell thicker. Dust was laid, and the water trickled from the roofs into the drain spouts. Then it rained. Sure enough, wet rain. And the people almost forgot to close the doors and put down the windows. They stood and watched, smiling and rejoicing, holding their breath and praying that the wind would not shift to the fatal northwest, which had blighted every prospect for 6 months. But in keeping on raining, the wise men who had been so skeptical began to say, "See, I told you so." In the very midst of it, the sun shone with such a whiteness and softness as never before fell on the gladdened eyes. People looked right into it without blinking. The clouds had lifted to the west and they banked to the east. They had met overhead and poured down their treasure until it ran in the ditches. It was a slanting, glistening shower of pearls, a rustling, rattling rush of silver beads on threads of invisible wire shaken from the sun. It fairly danced and sang like a living thing in the spangles of fresh odors. Two farmers with a wagon load of hogs drove along the road slowly, lazily, actually reveling in the money-making wetness. If the sun shines through the rain, it will rain again tomorrow. There was an added zest to the hope in the old weather proverb, and the double rainbow gave the promise of greater impress. It spanned the whole eastern sky with its ancient glory. And still the rain fell, now lighter, now heavier, now unfalling. And the thunder rolled profoundly and assuringly, not savagely and crackling, but so evenly and harmoniously that even the women smiled and were not afraid. It was a sweet, melodious hour. Supper got cold on the table, and the rain was more edifying than the victuals. As soon as it closed, the children were out wading in the puddles and squashing mud through their toes. The thrifty gardener hastened to set sweet pepper and eggplants and to look around for puddles to stick in the rotten beans. And then, for a benediction and blessing on it all, just as the sun sets, the clouds banked in the west and the north, and the gold of a dying day poured through the crevice and sputtered in the sky with a flaming yellow and red on the molten white of the heavenly canvas which the master painter designed now and then to exhibit the wondering eye of the children of men. Today the plows will be running. There will be crops hereabouts. That's definitely a poetic way to talk about rain. Okay. Oh, man, we could use the rain around here. Tired of being hot and dry. Alright, next one's poem. Not that one wasn't, but this one's a legitimate poem. And this would be Cotton by Walter R. Williams. I climb at dusk the narrow trail that leads me stone by stone up the slim hill's yellow crest where the broomweeds long have blown. And there I pause and turn to look, a sort of good night view, upon the still September field where soon shall fall the dew. And as I look, I half forget such painful things as these torn fingers, aching, painful back, and bruised and crimson knees. For beauty robes the resting earth, toilsome field below is magical, calm, and cool, with white and drifted snow. Nice. Okay, after next one, coming up soon. Our next story, dear cubs. Back Up Big Cat by Mrs. Bernie Babcock. Before little Abe Lincoln was 6 years old, his father bought some land on the Up Creek and moved from the cabin in which the children had been born to another, a little better. The new land, however, seemed more inviting for farming, and Thomas Lincoln said he was going to settle down, work the soil, and make a good home. Mrs. Lincoln would have felt sad about leaving her first home if the family had not been so poor there. But because her husband never stayed home long enough to cut the forest and make fields so corn and potatoes and vegetables would grow, they lived mostly on corn, bread, and meat. Mr. Lincoln caught plenty of fish and killed a great deal of game. He traded pelts for corn to make their meal, but they could never buy much at the store, for they never had money. And Mrs. Lincoln went without many things she needed. She hoped it would be better at the new house. Sarah and little Abe loved their playing place by the cave spring and hated to leave it. Still, they were not wholly sorry to leave, for there were other children near them, where they could live, and thought must be fun to have playmates. One of the first children who came to see Lincoln's in the new home was a little boy named Austin Golier. He was older than Abe, and at first the small Lincoln boy would not speak to him. "Howdy," said Austin. Little Abe just stared at him. "If you'll come with me, I'll show you where old Skinny killed a fox. That's my dog. The bones are yet there. We got the hat." Still, little Abe only stared at the strange boy. "And there's lots of places to go. The best Hogden's Mill. That's the place everyone takes their corn. It's made into meal there." "How?" little Abe said as he was at last interested enough to speak. "The water runs over a great big wheel outside the mill. It goes around this way." And Austin made a sweeping circle with his arms. "The stone inside goes this way." And another little circle was described by the boy's arms, this time with his hand pointing at the ground. "The corn goes in the place called the hopper and comes out meal. You want to go with me to see it?" "When?" "Next time I go." "Yep. How'd you like to have a whistle like this?" And Austin took a piece of cane out of his pocket and gave a shrill crawl on it. "Come on, I'll make you one. Here, you can blow mine till I get yours made. But don't spit in it." And he held the whistle to the new little boy. Abe took it and whistled, then he went with Austin to the woods. And this was the way they made their acquaintance. Abe never forgot his first visit to Hopkins Mill. It was a long walk through the woods, and from the time he started, he kept looking at the leaves of the first sight of the mill. But it was his ears that told him when they were nearing it, when he heard the splash of the water falling over the big wheel before he could see it. To the little boy who had never before seen anything, the mill was the most wonderful thing he'd seen. And Abe thought the miller must be the greatest man in all the world to know how to run machinery like ground corn. The miller was a large man. His face and arms were dusty, and it was hard to tell what kind of clothes he wore, so much dust had settled on it. But the dusty face wore a smile. The big man showed the small boy how the wheel turned, where the corn went in, and where the meal came out, and took him so close to the water wheel that it sprayed both of them. Next, the miller Next to the miller, little Abe thought the miller's mother was the nicest person he'd ever met. She was not little like his own mother, and her eyes were not gray. She was tall, with brown eyes. Her hair had silver streaks in it, curled back with a nice smile from her face. When this lady looked into the eyes of little Abe, he knew at once that he would like her. There was something so kind in her expression. Little Abe was not a handsome child. His face was narrow, his nose was large, and his ears were oversized, and stood out from his head, while his hair was coarse and dark. His body was thin, with long legs and arms and fingers. He did not know he was a homely child, for he had never seen himself in any mirrors other than a pool of water, and he never stopped to look long enough at his own face. It did not interest him much. Neither did his clothing trouble him because of its kind. In the fall, Abe's mother made him a pair of buckskin breeches which reached nearly to his ankles. His shirt had a very long tail, which was all the undergarment he wore. His coat was deerskin, and his cap was coonskin with a tail on top for the ornamentation, gold pieces down the side to cover his ears when the weather was very cold. His shoes were moccasins. In the summer, the moccasins and cap were put away until cold weather should come back, and a pair of homespun breeches took the place of the buckskin. So the question of dress was a simple one, though the job of making winter clothes was one Mrs. Lincoln did not like. While Abe was yet very small, his father said it was time for him to learn to work. He had always helped his mother carry water from the spring to the wood from the forest. But at the new place, Mr. Lincoln said Abe must learn to chop trees, dig out roots, make fence posts, split rails, and do all kinds of work. It was rather hard for the small boy to do so much work, and when Mr. Lincoln went away for several days, Mrs. Lincoln always let Abe go to visit the miller and his mother, who had taken a great liking to the little boy and wanted him to come often to see them. I believe, said the miller to his mother one day after Abe had been there, that's the hungriest looking little fellow I ever saw. I wonder if he don't get enough to eat. That's not bread or meat that he's hungry for, the miller's mother said. It's stories. You should have seen him when I told him the story of Robinson Crusoe, and when I told him about George Washington. His plain face lit up with real smiles. He's an unusual child and ought to have some schooling. In fact, there are several children in the neighborhood that ought to learn how to read, count, and write. He ought to have a school. When Abe became well enough acquainted with the miller's mother, he asked her many questions, some of which she found it difficult to answer. One day, when the miller was talking to his mother about buying a slave to help run the mill, Abe, who did not know much about slaves, asked about them. She told him slaves were black people with wool on their heads, flat noses, and thick lips, and white people owned them just like they did dogs or cows or mules and made them work. Trigger warning. Sorry. Where do the white folks get them? Abe asked. Buy them unless they have some already. People will own old slaves. They have little ones just as cows have calves, and these grow up to be big slaves. Where did the first white folks get the first black ones? Catch 'em somewheres? Yes, in Africa. If there was more black folks than white, and the blacks had catched us first, we'd been slaves, wouldn't we? I never heard such a strange question, the miller's mother said. Nobody could ever imagine such a thing. After the Lincolns had lived near the Hodgson's mill for some time, a schoolteacher came and opened a school in the cabin not far from the miller's home. Austin Golander told Abe about it and said he was going. Abe was afraid his father would not want him to go, and he was not mistaken. When the matter was mentioned to Mrs. Lincoln, he said, Abe don't need to waste no time learning. Boy is lazy as a white dog now, and he won't ever be no count if he gets starting to learn it. But Thomas, Mrs. Lincoln said, you know I have to count your pelts and figure out how much money you ought to get for them every time you sell them, more than a dozen. That's because you never went to school. And if I didn't do your figuring for you, you'd get your eyes cheated out of you at market. Somebody has to know how to count and write down. Maybe Abe gets big, he won't have a woman who can count for him like you got. You better let him learn to do it himself. Maybe you're talking sense. Anyway, I'll let Abe go to school until he learns to count to 100. There ain't nobody nowhere needs to know how to count more. So Abe went to school, barehanded, barefooted, without a book of any kind or slate, pencil, or paper. Sometimes he made his letters on the smooth ground where the boys played marbles. Sometimes he skinned the bark off a tree and wrote on the clean wood with pokeberry ink, which made beautiful crimson letters. The way to school was a long one. A portion of it went through the deep woods. But Abe and Sarah, who went with him, were never afraid. Danger never threatened them. So as far as I knew, but one time. This was the day when they were nearing a home and had come upon a patch of wild strawberries growing in the sun at the edge of the woods. Here, under the green leaves, there were whole handfuls of rich red berries hanging from their shelter stems. Sarah clapped her hands with such joy, shouting, I'll get you some. I'll get some for Mommy. Don't stop long, Dave said. The sun's behind the timber. It will be getting dark soon. I'll hurry. Next time, and the next minute, Sarah was on her hands and knees picking berries, pouring them into a dinner pail and thinking how pleased her mother would be with such good supper brought in. So interested was Sarah in gathering the berries that she never thought to look up. If she had, she would have seen, slowly creeping out of the tree branch over her head, an enormous cat with sharp ears and long, stiff whiskers. Very quietly it moved, nearer and nearer the child crouched by the berry vines, not making at least a bit noise. Having grown tired of waiting, little Abe, who had walked on, turned back. When he came near the tree in which Sarah was picking the berries, he lifted his eyes to meet the shining eyes of the big cat. Quietly, just as quietly as the cat had come up, the little boy moved where he could look into the animal's face. At first, the wildcat did not see him. Then, without moving his body, he turned his yellow eyes towards him. When the cat's eyes met the eyes of the boy, its tail, which had been moving slowly like a lazy snake, stopped. Abe stepped a little closer, never taking his eyes off the cat. "Back up, big cat," he said quietly. Abe stepped a little closer, keeping his eyes on the cat, and it moved. And as he moved at the cat moved too, backward until it dropped suddenly into the thicket and disappeared. Hearing the noise of the body in the leaves, Sarah sprang up, looking around. "It's gone now," Abe said. "The big cat was up above you with its claws all sharpened to grab your back. I gave him to understand I was waiting for him. The minute he dropped, I'd be on him and choke his tongue out. So he backed up. Cats have sense if they're wild. Let's go." And, taking his sister by the hand, the two children ran home as fast as they could. Mrs. Lincoln was frightened when she heard about the wildcat so near Sarah, but Thomas Lincoln was more interested than afraid. It was because Abe showed no fear to the cat and he backed up like you told it to. I've heard of hunters standing off panthers that way, and the next cat might not be so obliging. But Abe must be carrying something better to fight than his claws. So Abe's father got him a sharp little hatchet with a good hickory handle. His mother made him a deerskin belt with a place to hold the hatchet. Then he went through the lonely woods after that. He had something with which to defend himself should he meet a beast, which came toward him instead of backing up. Okay, well, this can't be a story about Abe Lincoln without some mention of slavery involved, right? Okay. Yeah, we got another poem. This is The Snowbird by John Banister Tabb. When snow, like silence visible, hath hushed the summer bird, thy voice, the never frozen rill, a melody is heard. But when the winter's lethargy and the buds begin to blow, thy voice is mute, and suddenly thou vanishest with the snow. Okay. Okay. And another poem. Skyriders by Lexie Dean Robertson. I can remember an autumn wood where elms and oaks and hickories stood, almost touching the cobalt sky, pearly with gulf clouds racing by. What fun to bend the young trees down, till bright leaves swept the earth's rich ground. Then mounting one like a swinged horse, away we rode on a magic horse. Up in the air so high we'd climb, chanting a nonsense nursery rhyme. Had a piece of pie, had a piece of pudding, gave it all away to see Sally good. And down we came to the middle earth, while the woods re-echoed our song and mirth. And now when I see an autumn wood, I always wish I somehow could turn back the years while I ride again the elm tree horse with the leafy mane. I'd give more than the pie or pudding if I could see Sally good. Okay. I think I'm gonna forget. So, our next story: The Deer as a Jumper by Archibald Rutledge. Many years ago, I was talking with a famous old woodsman of the Carolina swamps, and our conversation turned to the subject of deer, and particularly to the question of their ability as jumpers. Each of us was able to give some remarkable examples of a wild deer's power as a jumper, but neither seemed certain to the limits of this power. Finally, my old friend said, "Well, I believe that a deer can jump just as far and as high as he has to. While we cannot admit there's an element of truth in it, it is not often that a deer exerts all his powers as a jumper, and more seldom still is he observed to do so. As a matter of fact, deer's motions are singularly easy and graceful. When he jumps, he seems to float over obstructions without careful approach and without apparent effort. Moreover, the deer is singularly sure-footed. During 30 years of hunting, I have seen in the woods upward, I think, of 1,000 deer. Most of these were in the flights, in wild country where the footing was most treacherous. Yet I never saw an unwounded deer fall down. I have seen one blunder, but his recovery was so rapid that his loss of equilibrium was hardly noticeable. I once measured the jump of a deer which sprang from the bed, that is, the first jump it made from a position flat on the ground. I had approached the deer on foot across the dry bed of a pond, lined with soft moss, and was within 8 feet of the creature when it sprang up and away. It had been lying on the base of a huge pine, so a tiny clump of huckleberry bushes, too small, one would think, to hide a deer. There was a space of black, damp sand surrounding the pine, so that I was able to measure the jump with certainty. It was 14 feet 1 inch. But remember that this jump was made from a lying down position. While running, the average jump of the whitetail is from 15 to 20 feet, but by small efforts, a mature deer can increase the distance amazingly, as will shortly be shown. Perhaps the most impressive jumping I ever saw by a deer was done by an old buck, followed by hounds, which ran the deer into an abandoned rice field, where the mud and the water were 3 or 4 feet deep. Even in such footing as this, the deer performed remarkably. Not only distanced from the hounds, but his leaping in mud was extraordinary. While I could not effectively measure his jumps, they were high, far, and effective. However, as I watched the buck, it seemed to me that he was straining every nerve to clear himself properly. This was one of the few deer that I've seen actually laboring in his jumps. In contrast to his jump being made once a pet deer, and observed a sportsman who was a friend of mine, the deer was really only a fawn. One day, a little girl who owned it happened to be in a certain part of the yard near a 6 foot fence, and the fawn was on the farther side. Gracefully, the little creature leapt over for no other purpose than to join his mistress. It is a common experience among farmers and planters whose places are raided by deer that a 6 foot fence is no protection for their crops. I know of a hunting club which shut off its pea fields where a quail ranged and were being regularly visited by deer by an 8-foot fence. The deer did not cross this, not, I think, because they were unable to, but because they found that getting down in the ditch, they could crawl under the wire. This they did, and it was good proof of their intelligence that, night after night, they would thus enter the field and also certainly find their way out. I once knew a full-grown pet buck jumped headlong out of a window, about 16 feet from the ground, come out with no ill effect. In fact, the deer's legs have a wonderful power of resiliency. Perhaps the best example of a deer's power of jumping that I can give comes from a friend who lives at the village of Mount Pleasant in South Carolina. I shall quote his description from this experience. The only opportunity I've had for measuring a deer's unusually long jumps occurred on the front beach of Capers Island on June 16, 1921. Accompanied by a collie, I was walking through the woods towards the beach. The dog had trotted ahead of me and had reached the open beach when I was still 30 yards from it. The brush was sparse at this point, and I saw a big buck lying on my left within 15 feet of me. I stood looking at him for perhaps 5 seconds. Then he rose with a rush and was off to the beach. The collie saw him coming and seemed to think it was his duty to take charge and drive him down the beach, where I had a cow pen. It was a beautiful race. For about 75 yards, the collie kept between the deer and the woods, after which the deer gained and entered the island woods about 30 yards ahead of the dog, and 250 yards ahead of the spot where he jumped. With me at the time was Sergeant E. M. Bailey of the Coast Artillery. He and I will a little later observed the tape line and measured a number of the deer's jumps on the hard sand of the beach. These were contrasted with the collie's, which were from 9 to 14 feet and averaging about 11. The deer's jumps ranged in length from 16 to 28 feet, but in one leap was 31 feet 1 inch. This race was on the level, clean part of the beach, with nothing in the way and no apparent incentive for an especially long leap. Therefore, I suppose the buck could have done better if he had tried. It was noticed that, whether the stride was long or short, his 4 feet always came to the ground in the same position, and our measurements were taken from the front track to the front track, and from the right 4-foot to the right 4-foot. Such are the same facts concerning the jumping power of this graceful, beautiful, powerful creature with our wildwoods. And I never hear of a deer's remarkable performance as a jumper, but my memory of the old woodsman returns, and I recall his words on the subject. A deer can jump as high and as far as he has to. Okay. And now we have another poem. The Red-Winged Blackbird by Martha Young. Gay little whistler in the tree, blowing a bugle, choo-roo-lee, wearing epaulets rosy red, dapper cap on his saucy head. He was a soldier once, my word, gay little bugler, brisk black bird. His wars are over, and peace is so sweet. Still that evening he blows retreat. Okay, and now we have another poem. The Grapevine Swing by Samuel Minturn Peck. When I was a boy on an old plantation down by the deep bayou, the fairest spot of all creation, under the arching blue, when the wind came over the cotton and corn, to the long slip loop I'd spring, with brown feet bare and hat brim torn, and swing in the grapevine swing. Swinging in the grapevine swing, laughing where the wild birds sing. I dream outside for the days gone by, swinging in the grapevine swing. But over the water lilies, bonny and bright, back to the overgrown trees, I shouted and laughed with a heart as light as a wild rose tossed in the breeze. The mockingbird joined in my reckless glee. I longed for no angel's wing. I was just as near heaven as I wanted to be, swinging in the grapevine swing. Swinging in the grapevine swing, and laughing where the wild birds sing. Oh, to be a boy with a heart full of joy, swinging in the grapevine swing. It's weary at noon, I'm weary at night, I'm fretted and sore of heart, and care is sewing its locks of white as I wend through my fevered heart. I'm tired of the world with its pride and pomp. Fame seems a worthless thing. I'd barter all of it for one day's romp, swing in a grapevine swing. Swinging in a grapevine swing, laughing where the wild birds sing. I would I were away from the world of today, swinging in the grapevine swing. I kind of feel that one. Cubs, I really not feel this book that much, to be honest. But keep reading. So, our next story is An Earthquake by John James Audubon. In the month of November, I was jogging along horseback when I heard what I imagined to be a distant rumbling of a violent tornado. I spurred my steed with a wish to gallop as fast as possible to the place of shelter. But it would not do. The animal knew better than I what was forthcoming, and instead of going faster, so nearly stopped. That I remarked, he placed one foot after another on the ground with such precaution as if walking on a smooth sheet of ice. I thought he had suddenly floundered, and speaking to him, was on the point of dismounting and leading him, when he all of a sudden felt a groaning piteous, hung his head, spread out his forelegs, as to save himself from falling, and stood stock still, continuing to groan. I thought my horse was about to die, and would have sprung from his back the minute more elapsed. But all at that distance, but at that instant, all of the shrubs and trees began to move from the very roots. The ground rose and fell in successive furrows, like the ruffled waters of a lake, and I became bewildered in my ideas. I too plainly discovered that all this awful commotion in nature was a result of an earthquake. I had never witnessed anything of the kind before, although, like every other person, I knew of earthquakes by description. But what description is compared to reality? Who can tell the sensations which I experienced when I found myself rocking, as it were, upon my horse, and with him moved to and fro like the child on a cradle, which the most imminent danger around. The fearful convulsion, however, lasted only a few minutes, and the heavens began to brighten as quickly as they had become obscured. My horse brought his feet back to the natural position, raised his head, and galloped off as if loose and frolicking without a rider. I was not, however, without great apprehension respecting my family, from which I had many miles distant, fearful that their fearful that where they were, the shock might have caused greater havoc than I had witnessed. I gave the bridle to my steed, and was glad to see him appear so anxious to get home myself. The pace in which he galloped accomplished sooner than I had expected, and I found, with much pleasure, that hardly any greater harm had taken place than the apprehension excited with my own safety. The shock succeeded shock after almost day and night for several weeks, diminishing, however, so gradually as to dwindle into the mere vibrations of the earth. The earthquakes proceeded with more serious consequences than other places. Near New Madrid, and for some distance now in Mississippi, the earth was rent asunder in several places, one or two islands sunk forever. The inhabitants who escaped fled in dismay towards the eastern shores. Okay. Okay, I'm really gonna do three more. I'll set them up. Feeling the book that much. Maybe I'm a little distracted, I don't know. Our next story, Alligator Hunting by Minnie Moore Wilson. Possessing that talisman, friendship, and confidence of Seminole chiefs, our hunter arranged for the first alligator hunts. To simplify the account of the Tenderfoot's experience, we give it as related to the writer. Taking the little steamer Rosetta at Kissimmee City, 2 days' ride landed on the Banister, where I met by an ox cart driven and owned by the Seminoles. A ride of 40 miles, slow but sure, took us to the Indian village. Here I was met by dogs, pickaninnies, squaws, and braves. What time limited eager for the hunt for big game. I rested for a few hours and then announced myself ready to go. Aepus. In a cypress canoe pulled by Chief Tom Tigertail, we turned her boat towards the interior of the Everglades, and for 3 days traveled over a wild and weird land as Stanley had explored before darkest Africa. Pulling through water lilies, tall grass, and overhanging branches, frequently getting stuck in the shallow water marsh, all gave more zest to the square mile than 100 hunts in the North could. Reaching the objective point of our trip, the chief tied up the canoe, and after a heavy repast, we were ready for the alligator. No game laws obstructed our progress, no board signs to read, no trespassing, and as soon as we were equipped for the night's hunt, with a bull's-eye lantern attached to my tap, I took my seat on the bow, while Tiger Tail, standing in the stern, propelled the canoe for long, dexterous strokes. Reaching a deep bayou where the Seminoles kill hundreds of alligators each year, I was directed to throw the light quietly over the water, and the presence of the siren would be revealed in the reflection. Silently, slowly, our canoe cleaved the dark waters. Truly seemed was worthy of pencil of Dore. A moonless sky, a wild expanse of bleak water, a canoe propelled by a savage, splendid, carelessly on its unconscious grace, and as silent as the oarsmen of the river Styx. Soon the dismal solitude was broken by our entrance into the alligator haunts. The stealthy glide through the still dark water, we were soon aware of being near a very large gator. Two balls of fire shining in the darkness told the tale. Without a ripple, the Indian guided his canoe within 10 feet of the monster, and shot between his eyes with a 38 Winchester blew the top of his head to small pieces. Before the reptile could flounder out of reach, his carcass was grabbed and pulled into the canoe by Tom Tiger, and the spinal cord was severed with an axe to prevent any further trouble. At the first approach of our light, the alligators gazed at the most facetious manner along the boat to approach us in very close position. But after one half of the numbers had been slain, they commenced to vibrate roaring. playing seesaw with their heads and tails, slowly rolling forth their feelings with deep, thunderous tones. To me, there seemed to be 500 gators in that body of black water that night, and each and every one of them turned his burning eyes to my little searchlight. They shone like stars. I could easily tell a big fellow was noticing if his glaring balls were close together and far apart. If killing 4 or 5, I called out, "Enough!" The picture was growing too gruesome. The quivering mass of reptiles in our canoe made me think longingly of home. Ugh, all right, the Indian reassured me, and the canoe was turned toward camp. During the evening, the Indian chief had killed an 11-foot gator, so lifeless it seemed like he had been dragged to the canoe, that it was not considered necessary to cut his neck and back. The extraordinary vitality of an alligator keeps it from dying for some time, the nerves often living for several hours after the head has been severed. Our canoe was loaded to the water's edge, with a large sauron at the bottom. Presently, a low breathing greeted my ears. Soon it grew louder, and a faint motion could be felt in the boat. Still, I remained passive, the Indian pulling through the deep, tortuous stream. I had instinctively drawn my feet up, and when the great mouth which was toward me opened and began snapping angrily, his body began to writhe and twist and wriggle, which all the other gators in motion. The situation was growing critical and dangerous. Captain Tom, perceiving the trouble, came to the rescue with his axe, and none too soon, the huge sauron began lashing his tail from side to side. And had the Indian been less skillful in handling the canoe, it certainly would have been turned overboard. With a hideous cargo silenced, the Indian, always cool, nerveless, looked up with a humorous twinkle in his eye, said, "White man, afraid of us." He okay. Yeah. Again, Cubs, I do have to remind you that I did warn you about language in this book. So, the next one is another poem, Spring Plowing by Kenneth C. Kaufman. Sorry. Behind the house is an old red barn. Behind the barn is a hill. And over the hill was a long, long field, lonely and solemn and still. The cottonwood grows on the side of the field, and a bunch of lazy crows come and sit with limbs out on the limb sometimes and watch the widening rows. 4 big mules on an old gang plow, and me on the saddle seat. Nothing to do but cuss the mules. I'd rather plow than eat. Up and down the lonely field, singing some old fool song. With the plow slicing the good old black earth, the mules swinging along. Alone in the world that's all my own, feeling the breath of spring. Half asleep from hearing the song that keen-edged plowshares sing. Turning under the cotton stalks and crop from last year's crop, smelling the smell of good clean earth, I almost hate to stop. I hate to milk or do other chores. I hate to swing a hoe. And chickens, gosh, they're women's work. A hand, thank you, no. But plowing, there's a man job for a man. Just give me a good old team, and I'll like to plow the rest of my life. Just plow and dream and dream. Try to get through a few more. The next story is The Tornado by George W. Cable. Upon the sky a soft, faint tremor of light glimmered for a moment without disturbing the shallow below. Another glimmer spread dimly across the sky, and a faint murmur of far-off thunder came to the ear. Soon the stars are hidden, and the light breeze seems rather to tremble and hang poised at the blow. The rolling clouds, the dark wilderness, and the watery taste shine out of every moment of lead stream of lightnings. Still thickening darkness, which thunders roll and jar, and answer one another across the sky. Then, like a charge of 10,000 lancers, comes the wind and the rain, their onset covered by all the artillery of heaven. The lightnings leap and hiss and blaze, the thunders crack and roar. The rain lashes, the waters writhe, the wind smites and howls. For 5, for 10, for 20 minutes, for an hour, for 2 hours, the sky and the flood are never for an instant wholly dark, for the thunder of one another silence. But while the universal roar sinks and swells in wide, vibrant illumination shows all things in ghostly half containment. Fresh floods of lightning every moment rend the dim curtain and leap forth. The glare of day falls upon the swaying wood, reeling and bowing and tossing willows and seething waters and whirling rain. Then all are dim ghosts again, while peal, as if the heavens were rent, rolls off around the sky, comes back, shocks and throbs, and sinks the long roar that before it can die is swallowed up in the next flash and peal. A few hours later, the winds were still, the stars were out, and sweet silence had fallen upon the water and the wood. And from her deck, the watchman on the steamer would see the northeastern sky in a broad, soft illumination, and knew it was the lights of slumbering New Orleans, 18 miles away. By and by, further to the east, another brightness began to grow and gather its light into the outstretched wings. In the nearest wood, the soft twitter came from a single tiny bird. Another voice answered it. A different note came from a third quarter. There were 3 or 4 replies. The sky turned to blue and began to flush. A mockingbird flew out of the woods on her earliest quest for family provision. A thrush began to sing, and in a moment more the whole forest was one choir. What a wonderful purity was the fragrant air! What color was on the calm waters and in the deep sky! How beautiful, how gentle was nature after her transport of passion. Okay, and now we've got another poem. The Cripple by Mrs. Karle Wilson Baker. A bird came hopping on my shelf, with one good foot stuck with the other. It hurt my heart to see so maimed a feathered brother. Yet when he spread his wings to go, he seemed to launch himself with laughter, although to shame my sorrow thoughts that fluttered after. For none, for though he could not perch so well, nor strut nor swagger any longer, his wings were strong as any bird's, or were they stronger? Okay, let's keep going. The Last Bob White by Whitney Montgomery. Oh, how they murdered poor Bob White today. The booming guns were heard on every side. From early morn till evening passed away, the frightened coveys scattered far and wide. No spot on earth could hide him from his foes, for keen of sense the eager pointer came, and fleshed him from the ground, and as he rose, he fell before the hunter's deadly aim. But when the day was done, and all was still, the twilight's purple shades began to fall. From the summit of yon leafy bill, I heard the echo of a lonely call. It called into the night, but all in vain, for none of all his feathered mates were there to send the call responsive back and come to meet him through the chill night air. They say the wanton slaughter is a sin. They say the wanton slaughter is not sin, that birds and beasts were made for man's delight. But oh, there is such a lovely sadness in the plaintive call of the last Bob White. Well, here's one for Sif, I suppose. The Cleverness of Squirrels by Archibald Rutledge. Probably we rate the intelligence of gray squirrels far too low. I have long since learned, through years of familiar contact with them in the woods, how acute they are. I once posted myself between a noticed old den tree and a certain strip of longleaf pines to which I knew that many squirrels restored from the cones, of which they were exceedingly fond. I was not hunting, merely observing. I wanted to see whether a squirrel, making for the den tree, would rush dangerously close past an enemy or would use his head. It was in the morning, perhaps 10 o'clock, and the October sun was warm and bright. My watching was soon rewarded by seeing an old squirrel coming towards me. When possible, the squirrel loves to run on fallen logs rather than on the ground. This one was following a series of pine logs. When he came within 20 yards of me, I made myself known. He eyed me carefully, thoughtfully. His home, he knew, was 1,000 yards behind me. Then very coolly he made his decision. He changed his course, describing a arc around me. I mounted a hurricane log to watch him. His semicircle was perfect. I saw him when he reached the den tree. In precisely the same manner 5 other squirrels behaved. Only one was a youngster, and his arc was neither wide nor perfect. Later, I took up a position in front of the den tree, and here I found the squirrels. Several more came, would defy my presence, gaining the tree despite my leaning against it. A fox squirrel's shrewdness once surprised me. I saw one of the bald cypress in a tree in the pinelands. He had a curious looking object in his mouth. This I soon perceived to be a dropped deer horn. It is known that squirrels and wood rats and mice dispose of most of the dropping stag's antlers. The squirrel did not see me. He carried the horn up to his hole, but he found that he could not get it in. The points prevented him from doing so. Still gripping the antler in his teeth, he deftly backed into the hole. There he attempted to pull the horn in, but he had it near the point of the beam, so that the tines caught against the lips of the aperture. Skillfully, he shifted the antler in his mouth until he had it by the base. Then he drew it neatly into the hole after him. A remarkable aerial maneuver. Lately, I was talking to a Pennsylvania state forester among many duties as feeding wild game during the winter. I tried to feed a flock of wild turkeys, he told me, but the squirrels seemed to get to the better of me every time. Of course, the regular method of feeding is to cut off a growing twig about every 2 feet above the ground and stick an ear of corn on it so sharp point. But the squirrels climbed these twigs, bent them over, and ate all the corn. Then I tied the ears of corn on strings and suspended them from the tree branches. Do you know what the squirrels simply cut the strings? Then I tried wire, but the squirrels would go to the place where the wire was fastened, take hold of it, pull it up carefully, and thus get the corn. Finally, we put some tin discs above the ears of corn on the wire. This device seemed to baffle the squirrels, but it looked so very queer and trap-like that the turkeys would not come near it. I had never known before the gray squirrels were so resourceful. There they apparently are. person shows. Our next story, The Jackrabbit, by William Lawrence Chittenden. Ahoy, my old neighbor, how do you do? We have taken much pleasure in watching you. For your ears are generous, your whiskers so fine, and your legs are so long. We owe you a line. But you seem too centered out there on the weeds, just hopping around where there's plenty to eat. By the look of possession upon your grave face, we believe you imagine you own the whole place. But nesters and farmers are all cussing you. Still, you're my first neighbor, so how do you do? It would not seem natural if you were not here, though now yours is scarce as a maverick's deer. When the settlers have come, you will have to move out, for the man with a hoe knows what he's about. And you're such an eater of oats and of wheat, such a glutton, alas. Oh, why must you eat? Don't you know that your conduct is doing much harm? That rabbits don't really belong on that farm. Why can't you remain in the wilds and the breaks, whilst horned toads and lizards and big rattlesnakes? You are getting too greedy. It never will do. So goodbye, old neighbor. We are sorry for you. But your ears are so generous, and your whiskers so fine, and your legs are so long. We give you this line. Okay. Another poem. This one is In the Mountains by Cotton No. I met a little mountain boy as I rode through the vale. His tiny sister trailed behind, with pawpaws in a pail. I greeted him. How old are you? He tipped his hat. He tipped his cap. I'm 6. Where do you live? He smiled and said. Oh, back there, in the sticks. Then won't you have a pawpaw, sir? We gathered them today. I did not like the fruits, but said, Why, thank you, if I may. He held out the pale pawpaws up. His sister here is 4. Her birthday was last week, he said. Sir, won't you have some more? A jaybird blew his clarinet. The brown thrush tried his quill. The boy went whistling down the path as I rode up the hill. Okay. Okay, I'm going to make this short story my last one for the night, Cubs. So, this one is Helen Keller's Animal Friends by Helen Keller. I cannot remember a time in my life when animals and I were not best of friends. I emerged from babyhood, clinging frantically to the rough coat of my father's favorite hunting dog, a beautiful Lowland setter. Together, Belle and I explored the garden. Together, we fought our way through the box hedges and rose trees. I'm sure Belle was often puzzled to account of my peculiarities. She would watch me fall over objects with troubled expression in her kind eyes. With remarkable intelligence, she did her best to keep me out of trouble. She knew perfectly well that the rose bushes have thorns, and that thorns scratch children and tear their frocks. She would push and pull in her efforts to dissuade me from going where it was not safe. But when I persisted, despite her most energetic resistance, she gave in and faithfully kept her place in my side, poking out her head frontive to take the observations and prevent, if possible, a bump or a tumble. I loved Belle dearly. She was the most human in her patience and forbearance with me, but only I was able to. Only a little savage, more arrogant, ignorant, and apparently less capable of learning than my faithful companion in the greatest darkness. No sooner had I learned to spell a word with my fingers than I was seized with the idea of imparting this new accomplishment to Belle. I found her asleep on the shady side of the piazza. I sat down beside her and began to manipulate her blunt toes. She seemed embarrassed. She smelled her feet anxiously and whimpered a little, resentful. I kept on, determined to teach her how to make the letters dull. Realizing that further objection would be useless, she watched the performance with my stolen indifference, as much as to say, "Do as you please. I'd like to see you teach one, teach anyone me to spell." Yeah. Poor Belle, I grew angry at her clumsiness and pulled her toes too hard that she at last howled. But she bore me no malice, and was ready to play with me as soon as I had wearied of the lesson. I was fortunate enough to be born on a southern farm, and I grew up among a multitude of domestic animals. It was no exaggeration to say that I spent the greater part of the year, before my education began, in the company of my partner contemporaries. My keen interest in everything that had life led to my teacher be useful animals on the farm as useful as object subjects. I absorbed the language, satisfying my curiosity about living creatures, hunting for guinea hens' hidden nests, touching the cool, moist noises and threatening horns of the cows, holding the young pigs in my arms, feeling the great strutting turkeys, feeling their feathers rise, like a flock of birds hovering close to the ground, being held on the back of a mule, darkly one of the darky farmers when he plowed the cornfield. All of these experiences imparted the liveliest reality to the words I learned. A pair of red bantams was the delight of my heart. They were so tame that they would stand on my knees, billing and crowing, as much at home as if they were on the ground. One day, the lady bantam most amazingly laid an egg on my lap. When I was 10 years old, Mr. William Wade of Oakmont, Pennsylvania, presented me with a beautiful pony. I had just read Black Beauty, which had been put to my praised prince, and of course I named the pony Black Beauty. I learned afterwards that he was not black, but was the great matter was white. The Negroes cooked this little girl named Lily, and nobody objected. What? To this day, I tremble when I recall Black Beauty's pranks. I knew that I could. He knew that I could not see, and he took advantage of me in every imaginable way. When I was on his back, he did exactly as he pleased, as if some grown-up person was not near to discipline him. He would stop, eat grass on the roadside, rear up his hind legs, and snatch a pear of apple from a tree, nearly pitching me off the saddle. Indeed, I stayed on only by clinging desperately to his mane. He seemed to think I was bent on breaking my neck, and he aided and abetted me in that almost to his ingenuity. Nevertheless, we were great pals, and I loved him passionately. Black Beauty was kept in a paddock which was surrounded by a wire fence and entered through a high gate. I would find my way to the gate with sugar, but I would not reach the bolt that secured it. Black Beauty was crazy for the sugar. He would sniff at it greedily and would push my hands through the bars, and he would take the sugar and gallop away. One day I brought the thought I would tease him. Every time he reached for the sugar, I pulled my hand back. He noticed the gate impatiently, stood up on his hind legs, as if to bite the handle of the wooden bar, then finally jerked it up and down. He repeated this biting and jerking the handle until the bar slid out and the gate swung open. After that, it was almost impossible to keep him in the paddock. His cleverness and initiative usually enabled him to find a way through almost any barricade. On my first visit to Boston soon after my 8th birthday, I was taken to a menagerie and formally introduced to an elephant, a cage full of monkeys, and 3 baby lions. The monkeys were very mischievous. They pulled my hair and snatched the flowers in my hands. Their queer, cold hands made me shiver, and I did not like their antics a bit. The elephant was an enormous fellow with a breath like a blast from a furnace. He helped himself to a bag of peanuts I held in my hand, and swallowed them, bag and all. When I tried to feel his trunk, he objected and lifted it out of reach. His keeper assisted me to climb up on Jumbo's back, where I sat frightened but proud of an adventure. I felt like a little boat float upon a great sea, and secretly I was glad to climb back down to the firm earth again. The young lions were docile and playful. They rolled over on their backs and purred like kittens. I could not believe they would grow up to be the ferocious lions of prey. But when I saw 2 of them years later, I was convinced. As I stood by their cage, I realized that my innocent, pretty, good-natured lion kittens had undergone a great change, not only in their physical appearance, but also in mind and disposition. The lioness was so slender and more quiet than the male, which had developed into a powerful, aggressive creature with an opposing mane. His baby Pearl was now a roar that terrified me. I was not permitted to touch him, even through the bars. I have, however, touched 2 grown lions since then, also Trilby, the famous lioness from the Washington Zoological Park. She was as gentle and as beautiful as the Great Dane. She pressed her body against me and affectionately licked my hand. One lion, a splendid fellow, held out a huge paw to me in a friendly manner, and let me feel his great head, and even growled amicably for my entertainment. His keeper made him walk up and down the cage so that I might feel his stride. All of my life I've been interested in animals. Since my early childhood, the circus has fascinated me. I have visited nearly all the important zoological parks and menageries in the country. I have made an acquaintance of African buffaloes, hippopotami, sea lions, camels, and I wondered how anyone could ever thought of swallowing one. I have touched a prairie wolf and a Colorado coyote. When I lived in Rentham, Massachusetts, wild deer frequently ventured into our gardens to eat lettuce and other vegetables. They had been protected by law from hunters so long that they almost lost their fear of man. I could never get close enough to touch them, but if I sat under the old apple tree at the end of the garden where they had joined the hayfield, until they had finished their salad, I could feel their hoofbeats and the charge across the field into the woods. All of these contacts with animal life had helped to make the world I live in real and vastly interesting. It was the visits to the zoological park in New York City that inspired me the idea to write this article. One day last summer, I took 3 little nieces to Alabama who were visiting me to see the animals. Spellbound, the children watched some seals gamboling in the water, climbing rocks, barking in the sunshine, tumbling off again, and then swimming about, as happy as they were off on holiday instead of at home, doing the same things every minute of their lives. A solemn brown bear performed a clumsy dance for them. They laughed delightedly and clapped their hands. Then we were taken to the snake house, and the little girls played with a handsome Texas snake. He was most friendly, and I felt him kiss softly with pleasure as he coiled around the warm body of the smallest child. There were many snakes, all interesting each after his fashion. The keeper, a fearless man wise in the ways of serpents, brought a rattlesnake for me to touch, grasping his head firmly in his strong hand, so that I might feel the rattle, a terrible sound to all living creatures, as sweet as waters in the desert to his mate when he calls her. On our way to the monkey house, we stopped to look at the strangest mammal imaginable, the Australian platypus, the first one which had ever been brought to the American alive. It was in the water and came near enough for me to touch its wet furry coat. This animal lives on a certain kind of worm which boys collect for him at the cost of $8 per breakfast. Its nondescript appearance suggests that it's one of nature's discarded experiments. Or is it just an inside joke? One has the same feeling about the bat with his wings, the head of a mouse, or the armadillo with the turtle-like covering. The porcupine, so pincushion, anteater, mammoth bill, and the whale making believe he is a fish. Wendy, the great orangutan, received us with rough cordiality. She held out two hairy hands to us, and after looking me over critically, she climbed onto my lap and put her shaggy arms around my neck. The children were delighted and danced about us with glee. All at once, Wendy caught sight of the raincoat hanging up in the corner, and she was after it like a shot. It was very amusing to watch her try to put the coat on. However, when I took her hand and coaxed her to come with me, she smiled affably and marched beside me with a heavy tread as the face of a camera, which she eyed suspiciously. But she submitted good naturedly to the ordeal of being photographed. When we took leave of Wendy, each one of the party shaking her two hands in turn, she smiled in a peculiar way. You know that kind of smile I mean. If you would ever watch the hostess when her society friends tell her that what a delightful affair it had been, and what a wonderful time they'd had. The next animals to entertain us were the two giraffes. The children gazed at the strange, timid, sad-eyed creatures for speechless moments. We fed them with biscuits, and they followed us about sighing softly. I wondered if it would make any difference to the giraffe whether the tea was strong or hot. I was sure it would lose its strength around its stomach as iced tea, no matter how hard it started. We all thought the giraffes was the saddest creatures under the sun. Perhaps they are sensitive about their shape, poor things. The climax of happiness came when we all climbed over the massive back of Alice, the kindest of elephants, and she carried us around the ring with her long, swinging, heaving, pounding stride filling us with anxious, delicious anxiety. Okay, one poem. That's the end of the section of the book. Old Trees by Abram J. Ryan. Old trees, in your mystic gloom, there's many a warrior laid, and many a nameless and lonely tomb, and sheltered beneath your shade. Old trees, without pomp or prayer, we buried the brave and the true, fired a volley and left them there to rest, old trees, with you. Old trees, keep watch and ward over each grass-grown bed. It's its glory, old trees, to stand as guard over our southern dead. Old trees, we shall pass away like the leaves you yearly shed. But ye, lonely sentinels, still must stay, old trees to guard our dead. That is actually the first entire section of this book. Uh, yeah, so I'm gonna have to go through and highlight everything. Don't guess anyone came in. I read maybe an hour and a half. But that's not too bad. Let's see. Does anyone want to raid? Let's play Phasmophobia. He's playing with or he's by himself. Oh, he's got a fan there. Yeah, let's go right then. So, yeah, let's rate it over. That's about right. Yep. Okay. So, Cubs. I did warn you about the book. This is. I do the same amount of reading. This might last a month and a half, maybe 2 months. Again, I am on vacation next week, so. Uh, so, yeah. Have a good night. Let's go see if we can scare an auto. uh, Good night, Cubs. Thank you for coming in, Akami. Oh, great. Yeah. Have a good night.